All right, let's get more reflections, and I'm joined by ANC struggle stalwart, really, Pallo Jordan, a veteran of the African National Congress, who joins me now to reflect on the life of the late Archbishop Emeritus, our beloved Arch Desmond Tutu. Thank you for your time, Mr. Jordan. I always appreciate your insights into some of these historic moments, and this would be one of those, really, the passing on of, one of the last of a generation of leaders. Your own reflections as you received the news of the passing of the Arch this morning.
Well, first let me convey my heartfelt condolences to Cecilia and the immediate family. This is a great loss to them, of course, but it's also a great loss to our country and to humanity. I met the Archbishop during the exile years while he was at Lambeth Palace in London. And I think one can say about him that he is one of a long line of highly motivated Christian freedom fighters, inspired by the universalism of Christ's doctrine. You have, from the 19th century into the 20th century, figures like Khubusana. You have figures like the Reverend Mahabane, and you have figures like Archbishop Desmond Tutu, and I'm sure there will be others. These are people who played a very seminal role in the struggle for freedom in this country. And in the case of the Archbishop, he was fortunate in that he actually did live to realize that democracy that had been struggled for so long. He was, in a sense, also the conscience of this country amongst its 4 Nobel laureates. And in his case, received it because of his moral leadership at a very hard time in this country. Yeah, those are my immediate thoughts about the Arch.
Mr. Jordan, tell me about his role in terms of representing a leadership and a channeling of the energies against apartheid at a time when you in the ANC were busying yourselves with the work of opposing apartheid and seeking actively to, overthrow apartheid and introduce democracy in the political arena. But many of the leaders were in exile or in prison. And he and other religious leaders had that role of channeling the energies against apartheid. How important was that work?
Yes, the Archbishop played a very significant role at that moment. As you say, the liberation movements were banned, and there was very, very, very intense repression of any opposition inside the country. And he was in a position to intervene at that moment because of his moral stature. And he earned his Nobel laureate on the strength of his moral contribution and as a moral leader at that moment. Using the universalism and basing himself on the universalism of Christ's message, that is the common fatherhood of God, and therefore the human family are one. He made a stand at a very, very difficult moment. Because of that role that he played, he acquired the stature of some sort of moral leader in this country, which is why when we set up the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, there was no other that one could appoint to that position other than Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And in that role, he played a very significant contribution to our attempts to arrive at reconciliation for South Africans to come to terms with the fact that we have to now live together and build this country together. And I think there too, he had a very outstanding role.
And Mr. Jordan, I always, trust you to unpack some of these issues better than many people can. Talk to me about was there a point where there was perhaps a debate in the liberation forces broadly about the role of leaders such as Archbishop Desmond Tutu? I'll tell you why I ask this. I picked up a conversation that is said to have happened at one point where he was seen in some quarters as not being radical enough, some going to the extent of saying that he was perhaps delaying the revolution, and leaders like him, were delaying the revolution. That was on the one side. Whereas on the other side, in as far as the apartheid regime was concerned, I mean, with him speaking out, including that letter that he wrote in 1976 to J.B. Forster and many other activities of speaking out against apartheid, he was to come to be seen, in the words of the late former President Nelson Mandela, public enemy number one for the apartheid regime. Tell me about that tension of, he was not one for violence, even though he did not denounce the struggle altogether, perhaps the armed struggle altogether, but his was a non-violent method of trying to push against the tide of apartheid. That tension, talk to me a bit more about that.
Well, as far as I know, the Arch never, ever denounced the armed struggle. He did not himself participate in the armed struggle, and he did not personally advocate it, but I don't recall him ever, ever denouncing the armed struggle. And as I've said, he is in a long line of Christian leaders, some of them who were leaders of the ANC, some of whom were founders of the ANC, who have played this sort of role. So the ANC never regarded the Archbishop as either, an irrelevant personality, nor did we regard him as someone that we would be critical of. We saw his role and appreciated the role that he played, both in terms of raising the issue of the oppression and colonialism in South Africa to the rest of the world, and also because of his status in the church, able to mobilize thousands, if not millions, of Christians in this country in opposition to the racist, oppressive regime. So we appreciated his role, although there might have been, differences in terms of the methods of struggle that the ANC and he advocated. When the Arch left London to return to South Africa, in fact, the cultural troupe that I was a part of in London, known as Maimuye, which was specifically an ANC cultural troupe, we performed at his farewell. So that was how we regarded the Arch.
Yeah. Lastly, please reflect for me on, there's a period a few years ago when you were, sharing your own thoughts about the state we were in at the time in South Africa, and it seemed to coincide with him also speaking out at that particular point about, some of his unhappiness about the direction in which our government was being led at the time. Just share with me your own reflections on some of the words that the late Arch had to say about the movement that you served for such a long period of time, and his concerns about the direction in which we were steering as a country. How did you interpret those sentiments, some of the sharp words that he had for the ANC and its leadership, and whether those continue to be appropriate for us now as well as going forward?
One of the Archbishop's strengths was his capacity to be objective. And perhaps he could be objective because he was not as deeply involved politically as some of us were. I would tend to agree with many of the words that he pronounced at that time. we might have had different solutions and different paths at arriving at the correct solution to those problems. But I would tend to agree with some of his criticisms. The significant thing is if one has moral leaders of the stature of the late Archbishop, one is living in a very fortunate time because they have the capacity to remind you of your own responsibilities. They have the capacity to remind you also of the principles for which you stand. And they have the capacity also, in that respect, of correcting the path you have taken. So I appreciate the Archbishop's criticisms. There were areas about which we disagreed. I think one will recall the Dalai Lama issue. But on the whole, I think he was a very important moral figure. And yeah, his words need to be taken seriously.
Yep. Lastly, and it would be amiss of me to not ask you to share your own anecdotes, one or two, Mr. Jordan, of the Arch. We've been talking throughout the day about his sense of humor, his humanity. Just one or two that stick out in your mind.
Well, the one that sticks out most in my mind was when the University of the Western Cape awarded Mandela an honorary doctorate. At the time, the Arch was the Chancellor of the University of the Western Cape, and he was presiding over the proceedings. And I remember him saying at the beginning, okay, I will allow one toi-toi. That was the sort of person he was.